Hey everyone, welcome to today's presentation on BDSM identity and sexual orientation. Firstly, I'd like to acknowledge country. So I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land where I live and study, the Gadigal peoples of the Eora Nation, and I would like to pay respect to their elders past, present, and emerging, and extend that respect to other Indigenous Australians present. Today, we will be exploring the complexity and diversity of human sexuality and how BDSM and sexual orientation and identity can inform therapeutic approaches to promote healthy sexual expression and identity development. We'd like to start with some definitions. So first off, we have bisexuality, which is an orientation based on sexual behavior or attraction to both males and females. It is a part of the sexual orientation spectrum, and individuals who identify as bisexual may experience attraction to people of different genders or sexes. Moving on to pansexuality, which is the attraction to individuals of all genders and sexes. This includes cis males and females, transgender, intersex, and non-binary gendered individuals. Pansexuality is also a part of the sexual orientation spectrum, and individuals who identify as pansexual may experience attraction to both peoples, regardless of their gender or sex. Now let's talk about queer identity. Queer identity is a non-heteronormative identity that can be defined in concrete terms. Cannot be defined in concrete terms. It is individualistic, ambiguous, and deconstructionist, which, while many queer individuals experience attraction to more than one gender or sex, it's impossible to make a concrete assumption about these sexual behaviors or attractions. Finally, we have kink or BDSM identity. This type of sexuality involves an erotic attitude towards activities that involve intense sexual sensations such as pain, fetish, or involve power differences and expression of power and powerlessness, such as dominance and submission. It is a part of the sexual expression spectrum and is often intertwined with sexual orientation and gender identity. In a recent study, as you can see here, the authors explored bisexuality, pansexuality, queer identity, and kink identity using a grounded theory research design. The study sample consisted of 72 adults who self-identify as kinky and had primary residence in North California. They used a combination of community outreach and snowballing sampling methods and recorded a series of semi-structured interviews for future coding and analysis. The authors found 3 overarching themes, 1 being exploration, 2 being healing, and 3 being community. In regard to exploration, the kink becomes a gateway for some people to explore their sexual orientation or gender, while for others, it was intertwined and impossible to separate. So as you can see here in the first box, we have an example quote from the research. So when I first had sex with my wife, I thought, wow, that was amazing. I must not be gay, because I had doubts and I didn't know if I was gay or straight at that point yet. But clearly I knew I was kinky. I had always known I was kinky. I didn't know the different ways of being then. And then the second quote we have here, which obviously refers more to the kind of impossibility of separating these things from the beginning. It states, I got married and I had what I called my vanilla years. It was just repressed kink. And so I started exploring it, being the feminine side, more. It was surprising though. It was simply cross-dressing, and then it started merging into something more than that. And the fact that I was so much more comfortable when I was female. And then I noticed it now bleeding over into my male persona. Next, we look at healing, and this basically is supported from previous research as well. The main differences will probably be the stories as outcomes from the research in reference to this paper versus others. If we look at healing from isolation and shame, we have an example here. I was afraid, like I thought I was a freak. Finding that chat room was like, oh my God, there's other people like me. It was awesome. And then we look at the second version, which is healing from loss and grief. A friend of mine just lost her husband, and it was through me that she was first introduced into the scene, and she successfully managed to have a giggly fun time. It goes on to explain that she still slipped into tears, obviously missing her husband, but through this, I guess, interaction or engagement, she states that she had gotten her mojo back, and the person actually making the statement found that to be very meaningful in the sense of the relationship itself, and obviously the process of healing. Finally, we look at community. Now, in regard to connections to the community, it is an important resource for clients in their growth and social support for coping with stigma and minority stress. It also provides education around consent practices and safety issues. So you see in the first example, obviously referring to individual growth. This year, I received the award from the local kink community organization, and obviously they started to become quite emotional. I was really shocked actually that they had received the award, because they personally had this thing where, from a perspective of self-perception, they always saw themselves as the fat kid or boring, unworthy, and unwanted. They later had an interaction with someone and they were told that, they were seen, which obviously was quite meaningful throughout their healing journey and throughout their kind of like exploration and growth as an individual. Next, we look at the kind of like social support side of things in the sense of coping with stigma and stress. Now we've got, it was during that time I had my first real kink experience. I would return to him every month or so just to have a session. The participant goes on to explain that the person they were interacting with wanted to try new things and open them up to new things such as nipple play. So it's not stated here, but basically in the paper, they go on to say they go home after they're introduced to something, explore on themselves, come back when they're a little bit more open. And obviously they're explaining that through the community, they had this opportunity to explore in a safe environment, which they didn't have with their partner. The study in regard to implications of work highlights the importance of understanding the intersection of kink sexuality and sexual orientation or gender identity. As a therapist, it's important to work with kink sexuality without pathologizing or stigmatizing this aspect of sexuality. Competent care includes quite a few things that are going to be listed out in a couple of slides, but yeah, it is quite important to, I guess, see the outcomes of the work and the research itself in more of like a dynamic real life interaction. And these are the list of, I guess, insights that clinicians can take away from the research, basically provided by Combs, Nichols, Shabazz, Chirinos, Sprott, and Randall. And to give you a brief overview, we're looking at knowledge of local and national BDSM community organizations and resources, knowledge of the core sets of values within BDSM communities, and skills to assess the congruence between clients' behaviors, their personal values, and the community's values, skills to distinguish between BDSM and abuse, skills to distinguish between BDSM as a cultural context versus BDSM as an integral to presenting problems. We've got awareness of the psychological dynamics of coming out and skills to assess the place of BDSM in a person's identity or self-concept, awareness of the impact of minority stress on clients, and finally, awareness that BDSM is not necessarily an avoidance of intimacy. So obviously, these are all quite important when it comes to that client-patient relationship and fully understanding, the patient themselves in order to provide the best results or support. Finally, we look at the evaluation side of the research paper. So it's going to be broken down into issues and limitations, strengths, future research, and then an ultimate conclusion. When we look at the issues and limitations, basically we've got the sample size could have been a lot larger. 72 is quite small. It doesn't really give an accurate representation of the entire population in itself. We also lack quite a lot of quantitative data. Generally speaking, across the 50 plus years of research, this is actually quite consistent. There isn't a lot of quantitative data. It's actually primarily self-report data. And then finally, we've got the fact that it was a snowball sample, which is pretty difficult to generalize beyond the sample study, and effectively, it's quite difficult to replicate. We look at the strengths. The questions that were developed were supportive of a high level of generalizability and replication, which is great. The sample was quite diverse in regard to cultural and ethnic background, also very important. The results did support most previous research efforts and results generated. However, we were able to add some additional, I guess, hypotheses, future research opportunities through this research. And naturally, it also supports the approach clinicians must take when engaging with these communities. Speaking of the future research, basically, there are a few questions that popped up throughout this experiment, and listed out, they are, are kink communities and relationships a qualitatively different support space for bisexual, pansexual, queer people, in contrast to heterosexual or gay lesbian spaces? How many people use kink to explore their sexual orientation and gender identities? And finally, how many people use kink to heal or in ways that foster personal growth? And what are the implications of this behavior for clinical practice? Again, we probably need a much larger sample size, and a few different approaches in the sense of the methodology in regard to the research and the design. But yeah, it's obviously fantastic that we can open up these new opportunities for research in itself. And then finally, in conclusion, understanding the role of BDSM identity in attraction and sexual orientation can provide insights into the complexity and diversity of human sexuality. The research has explored that for some people, there is an intersection of kink and bisexual, pansexual orientation, especially around the category or label of queer. That kink behaviors and relationships allow for the exploration of sexual orientation and gender identity in some unique ways, and that kink communities and scenes can be important avenues for coming out around sexual orientation or gender identity in terms of healing from isolation and shame. And finally, it is important for clinicians to approach kink sexuality with an open mind and a deep understanding of the intersectionality between kink and sexual orientation or gender identity. Thank you.